Hey, welcome everybody. We are in our 10 general physical skills series again. We took a little break. Was that last week? We took a little break.
We did a different episode.
Yeah, we did a different episode last week. We talked about the open and shared some stories there. We're back talking about our 10 general physical skills. And the way that we're approaching this is we've talked about the trainable features of the 10 general physical skills. Cardiorespiratory endurance, stamina, strength, and now we're going to talk about flexibility today. And then in our future series, we're actually going to kind of buddy up some episodes together around balance and coordination, and then agility and accuracy. We're going to kind of sandwich a couple of episodes to that because we feel like those guys all vibe real well.
Yeah, or we're going to spend the whole time talking about how they interact with the other one anyway.
Yeah, right. So we're going to kind of mash a couple of those episodes up, and then we're going to talk about speed and power in an episode, because speed and power are really the expression of all these other 8 features of the 10 general physical skills. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But today we're talking about flexibility. And so first of all, I'm just going to kind of touch on I was looking at some notes and preparing some notes, and I had a buddy of mine that always would go back and look at different definitions, not just in fitness but just in the world. And he would look at the 1800s Webster's, because Webster's been around for a long time. And so you find the Webster's dictionary. We would always go back at the old series and see what the old definitions were of things and see how they relate to now. I always thought that was interesting, the way his brain worked in that way. But I didn't do that.
Him and I would get along.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking at I was like, oh, what is flexibility? What's the internet say about flexibility? But that's how I learned all my stuff about coaching. It's just the internet, right? So,
that's just the internet. That's just the best part of Wikipedia. Anyone from
it's all real.
Whatever, so you're getting all the information.
Right. Yes, exactly. But I thought it was really neat. The definition of flexibility is the first one, and there's a couple different options here, but it was the quality of bending easily without breaking. And the way I kind of thought about that, I was like, yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? And not necessarily bending, I'm not bending my bones to avoid breaking.
I think it's thinking more like a fiber,
correct,
or like a bamboo or whatever it is, that can bend without breaking.
Yeah, and honestly, I thought about that when it comes to the muscle structures and the tissue of the body, and actually that would be what it was. So I kind of, in my own definition, was the stretching or relaxing and contracting of muscles without breaking. Right. And so I thought that was, it's not a far off definition if that's all I could work with. But, flexibility truly is, it happens. And we're going to talk a little bit about breaking down the difference between flexibility and mobility. Coach has got a really good, thought around that. But, I think we, stretching in general, when we think about flexibility, we think about, stretching routines, or, mobility, we think about stretching out, or yoga, or some sort of hey, I'm stretching my muscles. But as we relate, when we think about these 10 general physical skills of fitness, is I don't think everybody always factors in that flexibility matters for how strong my muscles can be, or flexibility matters for how fast or how powerful I can be. And we'll talk about that in a future episode. But I think flexibility gets neglected in most fitness routines, I would say, right?
Yeah, because it's really easy to make the excuse, well, I'm doing these movements and that's getting me through range of motion and all that sort of stuff, and that's fine and dandy if it's working. Mm-hmm. But for most people, if they're firing back that immediately, it's probably something they've been trying to sweep under the rug, like purely anecdotally and just dealing with humans for the last long time.
Yeah.
I realized I am just over 13 years in CrossFit this month. So it's been a bit.
Yeah, been a bit. So why would we say that flexibility is really important to our athletes? Why would we feel like flexibility, and not even just to our people, but just flexibility in general? How do you guys find that level of importance for you?
For me, I think it's part of the picture of injury prevention. If you're not, you don't have that flexibility or that ability to relax, contract, you're going to get injured at some point. You're more prone to injury.
Yeah.
And then if you have an injury, because we all probably have old injuries or areas of tightness, or that if you neglect that, it's not gonna get better, it's gonna get worse, and then it's gonna aggravate, and then your body's gonna get out of alignment. So it's kind of, if you look at it as a pyramid, it's kind of the
It's
base.
usually one of the first dominoes to fall,
Yeah.
Mhm.
and that's the problem.
Yeah.
Like, when I did Kelly Starrett's course, his Ready State course, one of my favorite parts about this, and when he got to the point about pain, he's like, people look at pain as the first indicator, but it's actually like the last indicator that there's a major problem. And typically, one of the first indicators you're going to see is limited access to range of motion, which I look at flexibility like the very simple why is it important? It's access to your body. It's access to your body's capabilities.
Mhm.
Everything that's restricted, that's an expression of your own capacity that you're taking off the table.
Yeah.
And then as you move into towards like what Millie was talking about with injury prevention, that's what you're going to see first. And then the cumulative effect of missing that range of motion and doing these movements in an incomplete position, that's whenever we start getting achy. And now we start getting into later, like we start seeing as the coach, we see a missing position in a setup, then the range of motion starts to decrease, and then the athlete cares when there's pain. But we've had multiple indicators before that.
For sure.
And usually there's a flexibility / mobility portion of that was talking to us before.
Yeah, I try to, one of the biggest things for us as coaches is seeing movement with our client, like we're watching movement with our clients, but then we're highlighting, like I can tell you if someone's going to likely have a knee injury just by watching them squat. I can see a lot of things that happen when I watch somebody squat. So as they go through that active range of motion, I can see where they had limited access. They have limited access to hip position, or their hip mobility is tight. I can already tell that, or their ankle is tight. And so therefore they lack mobility there, or they lack range of motion there. That range of motion then challenges their foot in a certain way. By the way, our body is lazy. And so it will adjust to accommodate without having to like really do a whole lot. So if you lack range of motion in your ankle, you will tilt your toes out to access more range. Well, while you tilt your toe out further to the outside, what happens to your knee if your hip and your knee can't accommodate to that? Your knee will cave in and then will cause a medial stress to your knee. Well, when that causes a medial stress to your knee, it affects your tissues at the knee, it affects your cartilage at your knee, it affects your hip position, it affects then my low back, which then can affect my upper back. Like it's a vicious cycle. And
it's like driving with all four wheels out of alignment.
Right.
Like it's going to do damage to other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned Kelly Starrett. One of the things that I always think about when somebody's like, well, why does this matter from like an injury prevention standpoint? And by the way, like I'm not even talking about, I had this conversation with a client, like I tweaked this the other day getting out of bed. But then they showed me how they were getting out of bed. I was like, oh, like, well, the reason that hurts is because you don't have this range of motion to access that position. So in that awkward position, we find ourselves in way more awkward positions outside of the gym than we do inside the gym. And that's why we wind up with these like tweaks. A lot of people say like, oh, I kind of tweaked my back, or I had this thing, and they use the term wonky, which I hate, by the way. I hate that term I can't handle it. I can't stand it. When somebody's like, my shoulder just feels wonky. I'm like, that's not any sort of term that I validate. So, but that's separate. So that's a whole other podcast. But
it makes you feel better. I was ready to go with the exact same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So
I was literally like wonky, hate it.
Yeah.
Get it, but hate it.
Yeah. I just don't like it. So, but they don't have access to that range of motion. So then therefore they irritate tissue, or they irritate a joint because they lack motion there, or they lack range of motion somewhere along the chain. But Kelly Starrett always used that term. This was years ago during the mobility WOD stuff. He always used the reference of like the sports car, right? And you're driving your sports car, like a lack of mobility or flexibility is like driving a sports car at 90 miles an hour and then pumping the e-brake. And like that stress to that tissue is like the brake being set every time. So as I'm trying to elongate tissue and I don't lack that length in tissue, then all of a sudden my body's going, and then that again, pain is like the byproduct later on.
Correct. Yeah. It's one of the last indicators, but it's one of the first ones we listen to.
Mm-hmm.
And like you were talking about, what Josh was describing right there, because you can't do this, then you do this. that is what whenever we talk about compensations, that's what a compensation is. And the problem and the biggest issue with some compensations, not all compensations, like I live a life of compensation, missing a foot.
Sure.
And I break this down to trainers and coaches and athletes that I work with on the adaptive side, that you have to define your acceptable compensations and your unacceptable compensations. Again, I'm never getting my left knee over my toe. It's just not going to happen. I have to, that is an acceptable compensation.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is something that we could do something about, most likely.
Correct.
And because we're out of position and your body's so dedicated to doing what your brain tells it to do, it will compensate and it will work out of alignment with how the structures are supposed to work.
Yeah.
Again, if we want to go back to your car, now let's try to use that sports car to haul,
Right.
to haul it, to tow a trailer. You're going to destroy the car.
Mhm.
It's not because it lacks the horsepower to do it. It's because it's not structured to work like
To
that.
do that job. Yeah.
So these compensations pull us out of our design structure.
You may not realize this, that your body's been doing this until you come in to this type of scenario where you are working out, you are asked to squat and do certain movements, and then you're like, why is this weird? Why is this not working? But maybe you might have an old injury or something you did not even realize your body was doing, and then you come in here, and then we kind of have to take it apart to build it back up.
Yeah. Bill's been a guest for MileFit. He's been a guest on our podcast a couple of different times. We've talked a little bit about different things. And I remember, I go and see him not near as much as I should, but I went in and see him. And
I thought you were going to say not near as much.
I was like,
as
hey,
you.
man,
Awesome.
we need to work on my shoulder because I have pain in my shoulder. And then all of a sudden he's like, cool, man. Can you give me this access to your hip here? I need to do something. I'm like, no, man, my shoulder up here. And he's like, yeah, I know. Yeah, it's still like, and because again, he already knew that, like, because I was probably lacking some access somewhere else, the pain that I was experiencing was like completely secondary or third or last down the list, like you said, because he's like, yeah, that's great and all, but like I need to see down here and how that's moving because that's what's affecting. And like that's where like, and obviously I'm a professional in this thing, and I'm like, yeah, I know, man, like I get that. But even for me, that's hard to kind of fathom sometimes with my own body. But the compensations that we make, sometimes unknowingly, and that's the one thing that we've talked about too, is like that we see that stuff, like you said, is like usually pain happens, but like there's 4 things that we've seen down the line that eventually led to that pain of dysfunction. And then I want to hit on the other piece here in a second. So because you mentioned something about it's fixable, a lot of these things are fixable, but so then the other thing is, so we talk about flexibility. What's the difference between, because I think flexibility and mobility get kind of used interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
You had a really good like deciphering there.
Yeah,
the difference between
I
flexibility
keep it
and
really simple. And part of it is that mobility really wasn't a part of the vernacular
Mhm.
when Greg Glassman was writing these 10 physical skills.
right.
To me, I simply look at mobility versus flexibility. As flexibility is passive range of motion, mobility is active range of motion. It's the difference between bending over with touching your toes with the rounded back versus being able to perform like a proper hinge, say like your RDL or a good band good morning, and get far enough and hinge far enough in this active position in the joints to touch your toes.
Yeah. And I like that because I always think about like flexibility. I tend to see flexibility at the muscles, right? Or at the tissues there, where I see mobility at the joint, right?
Mhm.
And although that joint mobility can be affected by tissue, right? So there's tissues there's connective tissue that's all kind of encompassing those joints, but each joint has its own level of mobility. I think about the shoulder complex. And so the shoulder complex is, there's a ball and socket joint, but that socket that the shoulder joint sits in, the ball of the humerus comes into, is a very shallow socket. And the reason it is because it's meant to be a very mobile joint. So that's why your arm can do so many different things and so many different motions. Whereas the hip joint is also a ball and socket joint, but at the hip, that ball and socket is more encompassing around the head. That's why your hip does not do the same motions as your shoulder, or should not. But it should not, right? But you can also have hypermobile joints or hypomobile joints, where like I have my shoulder joint is hypermobile, meaning that either the joint doesn't sit in the joint space, or the socket, the ball doesn't sit in the socket well. There's connective tissue that is loose or weak or whatever else, or stretched. And that can create a hypermobility there where that leads down a whole nother chain of issues, somewhere else.
That's really challenging. That was one of my
Yeah.
first big challenges as a coach. In fact, this is the second time I've talked about her today. My very early coaching career, this is whenever I was like doing a boot camp class in a yoga Zumba studio. And gal, she was my age and she had autoimmune issue and narcolepsy, like she had a lot of that sort of stuff going on. It was really challenging, especially 10, 15 years ago where that stuff was seen as you're lying.
Right.
Whereas like, that's what it was okay for doctors to tell those people that they were lying. They were wrong. They weren't dealing with that, but she was extremely hypermobile.
Yeah.
And that is almost a bigger issue.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like, that's why I always try to tell people like flexibility, yes, it matters. Mobility, yes, it matters, but
There's a sweet spot.
everything should be prescriptive too, though. Like I always tell my clients, like all stretching doesn't mean all stretching is right for you if your body doesn't demand that a certain way. If I continue to try to get somebody to stretch their upper body, but really they have hypermobile shoulders and a weak upper back, like you have to understand the difference between knowing when strengthening is actually what would be considered not.
Yeah, are we lacking
stretching.
motor control
Right.
or access?
Right.
And those are two different categories.
They absolutely are. The other piece to this is, as you touched on this, Coach, was like most of the time, and it's funny, I reference Bill again, we've talked about this a couple different times with clients, is like most of the time when people lack access to an area, access to a joint, access to range of motion, eventually, down the road, some sort of pain, is created by that lack of access. Gosh, it's so fixable though. Like I always laugh. It's like I show somebody a stretch and they're like, oh my gosh,
you can
my
almost
knee
always
hurts. And I'm like, cool, let's increase the length of your quadricep muscle. And they're like, I'm gonna just grab your ankle, pull your heel to your butt if you even can. But if we gain access to the length of this muscle, they're like, oh, my knee doesn't hurt anymore.
Yeah, that's like another thing I really liked about Ian Kelly's course is he talked about that. He's like, what are you actually doing there? He's like, you're not lengthening out your muscles, you're restoring the natural length.
Right. Yeah.
Like something's bound up, fascia, whatever, and we won't get into all of that, but like you've got stuff like that is not, the sliding surfaces are not sliding.
Mm-hmm.
You're not actually making that's a muscle tear.
Right.
He's like, well, really what we're trying to do is restore the natural length that you have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's the other thing too, is like, I would encourage people, like, if you do like the stretching stuff, it's not the sexy stuff. It's just like accessory work, right? It's the fine-tuned details of things. But if you're not, like, if you're trying to do CrossFit group classes, or you're trying to do, boot camp or whatever else, but you're not looking at the global, how your body actually can move, or cannot move. Like, we're just asking for an irritation. We're asking for an injury. And again, like, your body's going to demand that access at some point, whether or not you want it or not. Either it's going to be in an injured state and it's going to go, oh, now you finally have to do this in a therapeutic level, or it's going to demand access and, you're going to have to actually do the work yourself. But this stuff is like, and we do it a little bit in our warm-ups, we do a little bit in our cool downs, but I always try to encourage our clients too, is like, hey, if you notice right side versus left side, you notice this left hip just doesn't feel the same way as your right hip over here in this stretch, like maybe throw that dude in your toolbox and keep that stretch into your stuff, right?
Do it during the commercials at night.
And that's exactly, yeah. So do it while you're watching TV.
Like you get to double dip so much here, because one of the reasons why we don't do a lot of, especially passive stretching before a workout, is it actually has a down regulation effect, very similar to like a massage. That's like that sort of work is down regulation. So that's why we don't want to do it before a workout when we're trying to up regulate. So we factor that in. We tag this stuff in at night. We just get these small touches because our body responds far better to frequency than intensity in this regard. It's going to do better if you do 10 minutes, 6 days a week than 1 hour once a week, is what I mean by that. So 10 minutes at night, an hour before you go to bed. I mean, stacks just real quick 3. We get the flexibility, mobility work that we need, that we've identified as a need. We get the down regulation effect while we're getting ready to go to bed. Cool. And we get another down regulator, and then as it becomes habit, it becomes a trigger for your body. It becomes a trigger for your body to release to release the hormones for sleep.
Yeah.
So now you get 3 huge benefits from that 10-minute a night habit.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a goal of working on my flexibility and mobility a little bit more this year. And I was like, I want to do an hour a week. Just so you know, I've failed at this the entire year.
We're 0-4.
That's far I have. But what I have done is I've found about 30 to 40 minutes in intervals of 8 minutes. It's 8 minutes long or 15 minutes long. So the two options I have. So I use,
Episode of Bluey?
it's not episode of Bluey, although those are also 8 minutes long.
Are
So
they?
you could, yeah, they are. They're 8 minutes long. Yeah. So
The
but
childless-
there are so many options out there for apps. The app I currently use is GoWad. The reason I like GoWad is because you go through a little bit of an assessment and then it will give you a personalized daily protocol. And you can choose 8 minutes, 15 minutes, or like 22 minutes. I've never chose the 22 minutes, but 8 or 15 works for me. But I do them in small increments, like you said, because it's frequency over duration of doing that. The other thing too is that I would share with you is like something else that we're doing now, and this is something that we're implementing for our intro programs for our clients, is that MileFit actually does an 18-point movement screen. Some of this is flexibility based, some of this is motion based, right? So talking mobility versus so active versus passive, things like that. But then they provide protocols to our clients that show, hey, this is where our limitations are. This is where our limitations could be as we get active into group classes or personal training. And that's huge for our staff too, because we're already keeping our eyes on these things. But at the same time, now we even know what to highlight even more when a client gets into a deadlift position or whatever else, and we know they lack access in a certain area, we can better train them. But then they also have these home exercise protocols to be able to implement. So like on the lowest varied entry, like go download an app, GoWad, RomWad's another one. Ready State has some stuff there too. But those are things that you can access at home and take care of. But then also, if you're a current client of ours, you can actually access that 18-point screen with MileFit. It's an expense. You pay a fee for it, but gosh, it's so beneficial to help you move better and find access to those things.
Nobody's had anything other than glowingly positive things to say about it.
Right. And then as a new client, that we have actually worked to include that in our intro programs now, just because we believe it's so important to be able to find that, especially as a new client when we're learning for the first time how our body moves in this type of setting, and our staff is that as well. So that's all I got, guys. Anything else?
Got about 20 more minutes. No,
We don't. We don't have 20 minutes.
I don't have 20 minutes
We don't,
left,
yeah.
but I don't have 20 minutes to take stock. No, this is, yeah, like I said, I mean, the reality is that for the most part, this is not a big undertaking if you'll take the small doses.
Yeah, for sure.
Like it's far more akin to brushing your teeth than it is to running a marathon.
Yeah. And then my last piece would be like, this stuff matters even if you're not in an exercise program. Like this is
It's the first thing to go.
these are the reasons why you feel tight putting your shoes on in the morning. These are the reasons why, it's a lack of access to that range of motion. It doesn't have to be in an exercise setting. So if you notice that like I can no longer reach my arm behind my back to wash it, like that's a lack of access to that range of motion. It will affect your function moving forward. It's just at what degree and what standard. What we find with people who exercise is they expose that.
And then they're given
faster.
And then they're in a situation that it benefits them to improve it. So they've got that, they get the feedback and then they get the positive reinforcement for improving it.
Yeah, for sure. Next week, we're going to talk about balance and coordination, and then agility and accuracy. And then we're going to finish off with speed and power. And we'll talk about all these things, including flexibility and mobility, help us generate power and generate speed. So take care, guys. Happy week 2 of the Open, I guess. Maybe it'll be week 3.
As we're doing this,
episode comes out.
we've got people doing
Yeah.
the second week today.
Yeah, second week today, and then next week will be the final week of the Open by the time you guys see this. So take care. If you want to learn more about getting started with this, or getting one of those MileFit screenings, you can jump on our website, click the Start Now button or the Learn More button, whichever page you're on, and submit email, phone number. We'll reach out, get you set up for a consult, and be happy to help. Take care, guys. Talk to you soon.